Welcome to Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today is the award-winning author of 25 works of fiction and non-fiction. Her oeuvre spans different genres, including novels, short stories, Himalayan studies, mythology, anthologies, books for young readers, and a play. Her debut novel, Paro, Dreams of Passion, published in 1984, has been reissued as a Penguin modern classic. Life in Mars collected short stories will be published in December 2025. She's the co-founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival. She's committed to platforming literary dialogue and showcasing the rich diversity of multilingual Indian identity. Namita Gokhale, welcome to Meet the Writers. Namita, you are in the middle of an extraordinary life. And I want to go back to the beginning. You were born in Uttar Pradesh?
I was born in Lucknow, which is the capital city of Uttar Pradesh, in 1956, which seems a long time ago, on the 26th of January, which is Republic Day in India. And I was named Republica. And it's not a nice name to carry around. And I'm very glad that they changed it. When I was few months old, they changed it from Republica to Namita, which is very inappropriate. The Namita is the polite one. And I am not famous for being polite, but well, at least it's a nice name.
You come from a long line of illustrious writers. You were brought up by your aunts and your grandmother.
Yes, I was brought up by my aunts and my grandmother in a place called Nainital, which is high in the mountains. There are a lot of writers in my family, so many that, I don't know, a lot of lawyers, but more than lawyers, everybody seems to be. There is one of my aunts, we're a very loose community of tightly knit relatives who are related in 3 or 4 different ways. So they become more than the sum of those individual relationships. And let me begin with somebody called Shivani, who was one of the most famous Hindi writers of our times. And she wrote more than 50 novels in her time. And I remember once I was launching one of my books, and her daughter, who was also a very famous writer, was in conversation with me, on the stage with me at the Jaipur Literature Festival, for a book I had written called Things to Leave Behind, about the history of those mountains. And I happened to mention to the audience that the sari I was wearing had once belonged to Shivani and been gifted to me by her daughters. And then when I went in for signing, more than the book signing, there were about 12 women standing there waiting to touch that sari, which had belonged to a writer they loved. So there's that. Then my daughter is called Shivani, and she's written one very good novel and is writing another. My daughter Meru was the publisher and editor-in-chief of Penguin Random House in India. Now she's set up her own company and is working, in fact, with AI in publishing and editing. And then I have about 15 cousins who are writing, I don't know, poetry, books, all kinds of books, nieces, grandnieces, nephews. It's so many. And of course, a lot of people are writing these days, but it is nice to be surrounded by people who love books and appreciate books.
When did you start writing?
No, I thought I'd be a painter. I was always one of those who had good essays read out by the class teacher, if you know. I'm sure it happens around the world that one hard-working, smarmy kind of girl is told that, oh, your essay is very nice. But I wanted to be a painter. It never happened. And I got thrown out of college. And that's, I think, what really made me into a writer, because I loved literature. I was studying English literature. In my course in English literature, there was a paper on Chaucer. And there was an alternative paper on modern Indian literature in Hindi. So I decided to do the modern Indian literature in Hindi, because I thought it was more relevant to me than Chaucer. But I was in a convent college, the College of Jesus and Mary, and the principal was very fond of me, and I think she was more fond of me than she should have been. For some reason, she held me back, and I was not allowed to give the exam because I had not studied it. So it led to all kinds of issues of percentage, and there was a discretionary thing in the percentage of attendance one needed to, and then she held back 120 students. It was a very long case. We went to court, and it was, in the end, we won the case, so many of us, but it was a minority college, so it was the discretion of the principal, and she chose not to use her discretion. And so I'm not a graduate, and I think that was very, very important for my development as a writer, because when I said, I'm not going back to college, I didn't feel up to going through the whole thing of that whole nonsensical Chaucer versus Indian literature argument. So I started a film magazine. In those days, it wasn't very smart to start film magazines. They were still in the popular culture region rather than the Bollywood has a certain camp art feel now to it, but it didn't then. But I did. And then I started writing my first novel, Paro. So I think the fact that I had been liberated from an academic education made all the difference to how Paro found its voice.
All of this is going on, but at the same time, you get married at just 18 and have 2 children during this whole drama.
Yes, it was a very crowded time of my life, and it had lots of drama at different levels, and also a lot of very, very frenzied experiences, but also some very quick learning about so many different things in life at that time. And I look back on it, and yes, it prepared me for a lot of things. But writing this novel and finding the moment when I came to London, and my husband said, give me a ticket. He said, go to London, look for a publisher. Those days, Indian publishing was very nascent. And I came here and I rang up somebody in India, very, very famous writer, had said, go to Curtis Brown. Those were the days of telephone directories, and I looked it up. They said, you can come over and hand up. We don't meet anybody. You can leave the manuscript here. I left the manuscript, and the next day the agent rang me up and she said she'd take it on. And the very next day, I had 2 publishers. I had Chatto and Winders, and I had Jonathan Cape. And I had 2 editors. I had Tom Mashler, and I thought I was in a dream or a nightmare, because if I woke up from this dream, it would be a nightmare, and Carmen Callell. And the book was published. It did very well here in London, and it did very bad. In India, it sold a lot, but I got a lot of negative reviews and a lot of negative reactions, because they couldn't understand how a well-born, well-brought-up Indian girl was writing a book like that.
Let's just explain to the listeners what the book is like, because I'm in the middle of it now. I'm absolutely loving it. It's sexy, it's funny, and I completely agree with the people who are criticising you. What do you think you were doing 40 years ago, releasing a book like this that is even now quite, titillating? How on earth did you get away with it back home?
Well, I dedicated it to my mother-in-law. That was one. And my family. My husband's family was extremely supportive always. I remember when I was writing the book, my father saw he saw me working at something, so he'd already watched me drop out of college, and he was all a bit worried what I was up to. He said, what are you doing, child? He was a very gentle father. I said, I'm writing a novel. He said, what is it called? I said, Paro, Dreams of Passion. He said, I hope you've been discreet. Well, discreet I hadn't done in this book. But I didn't see what was wrong with it. I thought it was just a funny book, and I still think it's a funny book. But it's funny in the sense that I've laughed in this book at things which people in those days didn't laugh much about. Especially, there are a lot of men who are very funny in it. So a lot of people reacted by saying, oh, it's a very sexual book. I don't think it's a sexual book. I think it's a funny book. And what surprises me is that it's been in print for 40 years. Successive generations have read it and looked with a little surprise at me and said, you wrote this? I said, yeah. But it's just funny, and social comedy doesn't usually survive. So it's one of 2 things. Either social comedy doesn't survive, but India hasn't changed, or else social comedy doesn't survive, but the kind of social comedy which I've hit the nerve on in this novel does survive, because it's a more universal reading of human nature. And most delightful and also the most ironical thing is that it has just been issued in India as a Penguin Modern Classic. So that's like, if I had known 40 years ago that all the muck that was being thrown at me and the sort of trash I was being garlanded with, that this book would end up as a Penguin Modern Classic. I mean, I wouldn't have believed it then. It's made me happy now.
There has been great tragedy in your life too, though.
Yes, I lost my husband when I was very young. And I've had a series of weird illnesses, some serious, some quite serious, some very serious. I had cancer when I was young. I mean, things happen to me. My life seems always to have been up and down, up and down, up and down. But I mean, there must be something wrong with me that when things are, I've just carried on.
After cancer, when you were healing from that was when you started your Himalaya trilogy?
I still remember I had a wonderful agent at Curtis Brown called Anne McDermott. And I was sitting with her, couldn't believe that my first book was going to be published and things. And she gave me wise counsel. She said, look, Namita, you should feel, don't give up, don't rest, don't feel too pleased with yourself. When you have a whole bookshelf of books that you're getting near where you're supposed to be getting to. So I looked forward to that, and I said, I know the next novel I'm going to write is about X, Y, Z. I had some thoughts about the next book or two I was going to write. But then I got so much negative publicity in India, so much, I won't say hatred, but scorn, that I just couldn't write very well after that. And I wrote another novel which was very serious and very depressing, just to prove to the world and to myself that I was actually an intellectual. Because in college I'd been one of the hardworking literary types. But those books, they lacked something, because maybe they were written without that sense of joy and fun, which was so much there in Paro. But then they worked out. And then also I wrote a novel called The Himalayan Love Story after this, which then wasn't published for a long time, but it became a part of what I call the Himalayan trilogy. There are 3 books set in the mountains. There's the Himalayan Love Story, then there is a book called The Book of Shadows, which is one of my favorite books. It's a ghost story told by a ghost who lives behind a curtain in an old house. I think it's a very good book, but it's a bit dire, it's a bit depressing, but it's beautiful. It's a book I'm proud of having written. And then I wrote a book called Things to Leave Behind. They were written at a distance, but they're a set of 3 books that are important to the work I've done, because the third book was called Things to Leave Behind. And it's about the history of the Kumaon Mountains, where I come from, and has some very powerful women characters, and is very funny in its ways. I do tend to have a slightly bizarre sense of humor. And this one won the Sahitya Academy Award, which in India is a very, very important award. And it sort of puts you into the literary canon. So I was very happy about that. So that's 3. I've done a lot of other novels. They've all been very different. I think I've lost track of how much I've written. It's 23 books totally. And out of that, there are either 12 or 13 books of fiction, depending on what you count as fiction or short fiction or your fiction. So I've got confused. A lot of books out there.
You also produced a television show about books.
That was a show called Kitab Nama, Books and Beyond, which was broadcast on the national broadcaster Doordarshan in India. And Doordarshan has the most enormous footprint. I can't give you the numbers, but there is nothing in India that reaches with the same tentacles to every small town and village in India. This was a weekly show, which was bilingual or sometimes trilingual. It would have Hindi, English, and 1 more Indian language, and 3 segments from across different languages, different perspectives. And we would shoot some of it at the Jaipur Literature Festival. We would shoot some of it on the studio. And there were 100 episodes they're up on YouTube still, Kitab Nama, Books and Beyond, and I think they're quite a good resource. So I really enjoyed doing that, because one of my passions is to resonate the wonderful literature being written in the Indian languages.
Do you write in English?
I write only in English. I wish I could write in Hindi. A lot of my books have been translated into Hindi, and I'm a sort of honorary Hindi writer because the Hindi world is quite different from the English world. Though, of course, now with more and more translation, it's a little more porous, permeable. But I'm deeply involved with, I read in Hindi, but I write only in English.
On to your festival work now. Before we get on to Jaipur, which of course is, I think, the biggest book event in the world, tell me about you had another festival for about 10 years.
It ran concurrently with the Jaipur Literature Festival. It began like this, that in 2002, I helped the Culture Ministry, the ICCR, Indian Council of Cultural Relations, to host a festival which it wasn't the first, but we called it the first International Festival of Indian Literature. And it was held in 2002. And it brought together the diaspora writers of that time who were writing in English and the Indian and English writers from India. So at that time, I think Namita Gokhale was not living in India. Vikram Seth was not living in India. We had Sir V.S. Naipaul with us. There were people from around the world, and there were the Indian writers. And I helped to curate that. And what meant a lot to me was that the Indian writers writing in the 22 Indian languages, many of them old and historical languages, wonderful writers, had harbored the sense of grievance, this hurt, because somehow the press and everybody was just taking notice of the Indian English writers, but they were disregarding the Indian writers in the Indian languages. So when they came together in this beautiful old fort in Nimrana where we had it, there were some sparks, and there was a lot of anger came out. And I was very glad for that anger to come out, because you have to say things as they are to the various people, and the Indian English writers, and I thought, I'm sorry if that sounds confusing, but I thought at that time that if the English writing in India, because we are the second largest population of English-speaking people in the world, so if the English writers in India and South Asia and the Indian language writers in India and South Asia came together and were in conversation with each other, then we'd have a literary moment. But I'm happy to say it's happening now because there's so much translation. And at this point, I'd like to explain to you something about Indian multilinguality. Many Indians speak 2 or 3 languages, and they speak them with different degrees of fluency. And this is reducing, but it's there still. Maybe it'll increase again. And so each of these languages has a footprint sometimes outside India. For example, Urdu is spoken in Pakistan as well. It's an Indian language, one of our 22 national languages. Nepali is the national language of Nepal, but there are more Nepali speakers in India than there are in Nepal. Tamil is spoken, and also another language called Maithili is the second national language of Nepal. Tamil is one of the national languages of Sri Lanka. Also, Tamil is prominent in Singapore. Malayalam is the language of the Middle East now. So their footprints. And the way it's best described with a rather pedantic phrase, but it's an accurate phrase. It's called many languages, one literature. So that's the story of this. And this literature goes back to very deep foundations in epic and myth in the different languages. So I'm very honored and proud to be a part of this literature. And all that I do in the Jaipur Literature Festival is try to bring languages and cultures and people together, not just whoever's top of the best-selling list that year. That's very important. But there may be people who've just not been noticed or been forgotten. But the larger themes that come out that for me matter are the universality of literature.
Tell me about the reading population, because it seems to me that it's a very, very literate population, that people genuinely love books. I mean, here, for instance, you can't get a television show about books made. I mean, there are a few, but very, very small audiences. That's not the case in India. Is that sheer weight of population, or do people there just love books more than we do in this country?
I think people love books more in this country than they do in ours, in some form and format. But I think people love reading and literature, and there is so much oral literature also. And one thing that always strikes me about India is that there is a lot of public poetry. I don't know of any other nation anywhere in the world where the famous poets also write songs and lyrics for films. So our great poets like Gulzar is one of our greatest poets, but he's known down the line in the public as a poet because of his songs, which have been sung in hundreds of films, literally. Or Javed Akhtar is one of our most famous poets. And it's the same, that he writes and publishes serious poetry, but his songs are heard and sung and remembered. And these are the two great living poets. But there was a poet called Sahir Ludhianvi. There were poets like that before who wrote in Hindi, Urdu, and different languages. And so there's a public appreciation of poetry through film, which was unexpected, but it's there. And then our two national epics, foundational epics of Indian culture, were the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. And the two of them are also, just like the tale of Genji is so important in Japan, the Mahabharata is, I mean, I've done a version of the Mahabharata for young readers in India, and it is, I mean, I can confidently call it the greatest story ever told, because it's the longest ever written epic, and it has, it's not a prescriptive ethical text. It has every aspect of human nature in it. And one of the lines that describe it says, whatever is there in the world is there in this text.
Yes.
And whatever is not there, this is nowhere in the world. And this began as an oral thing, was textual, put into text, put into theatre, put into drama, put into songs, music, translated into every language in India. So, and it is about human nature. So every aspect of human nature is dealt with, from transgender identities to love, to hatred, to intrigue, to manipulation. Every aspect of human nature is there. And it's set, Mahabharata is set in the course of a brutal war. And then it's the troubled peace that comes later. So all these things, you know, when you grow up hearing bits of these, you may not hear the whole story, but it's the literature of India, the oral literature of India, the prayers, because the prayers are also often very beautiful poetry, and the film songs, all this, it seeps into you. So there's a creative and imaginative background. And within that, so much writing is happening. The last 10 years were slightly repressive in India at so many levels. But publishing flourished, writing flourished, and festivals flourished after the success of the Jaipur Literature Festival. There are festivals in small towns and villages, actually. There are people who do a round of 10 villages and, you know, rotate their festivals there. And there are rival festivals in small towns. So it's there, you know, the desire to read, to hear, to educate. But for me, what I also have tried to unsuccessfully work on, I worked on trying to promote translation, so have so many other people. That has worked really well. But, you know, not everybody who is illiterate, this word illiterate is used very randomly sometimes. The people we call illiterate may have so much memorized text in their heads. The oral literature of India resides in memory, and that is getting lost.
Let's talk about Jaipur. We're actually at the Jaipur Literature Festival in London, which takes place at the British Library, but your main festival takes place, obviously, in Jaipur.
So Jaipur is, this will be our 18th year, I think. I'm confused. I know 17th was this year, so next year should be the 18th year. And there were 2 years before that where it was under another banner. But William Dalrymple and I are the two co-directors, but there are so many people who have contributed to make it what it is. There is Sanjoy Roy, who's the producer of the festival. There's Faith Singh, who thought of it first. There is Teamwork Arts, the producers of the festival, who have the most incredible team of creative people. And I think Sanjoy's background in theatre helped to make William and my literary programming come alive in different ways. And there's something about the city of Jaipur. It's traditional, but it's very cosmopolitan. Apart from that, I can't think of why a tiny festival, which we just did, and which had some based on the experience I had of doing that first International Festival of Indian Literature, I don't ever use the word seminal because I've been told it's the wrong word to use, but I'd say it was seminal, that festival. But Jaipur, I find it like some mysterious mythical creature that one glob of plasticine and one bit of plastic had some magical something infused into it, and it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew. And sometimes I get credit for it, but we all work hard on it, but hard work doesn't lead to what has happened to the Jaipur Literary Festival.
Give us a sense of its size.
Well, I'm no good at numbers, but at any given time there are 15 to 20,000 people there. There are, I think, 400,000 to 500,000 people in any 5 days that come by, and they listen. This year there was a day of storm and rain, but the audiences didn't budge. It was cold, but they didn't have umbrellas. They were listening. They overflowed from the tents, and they listened, and we spoke. I had a session on one of those days where I had lost my voice, and it was raining, but I went on croaking. I didn't give up, and it kept raining, and people were there listening. So there is people who come there because it is a transformative experience, because it is a spontaneous festival. We don't over-direct it. We give it a grid, we give it a format, but the feeling is that you can go up on stage and actually communicate with the audience. We try to discourage the more pompous writers, but they have their place in the multiverse also. But it's just some magic happens there. Don't ask me what it is. Sometimes the local festivals also have it. I'm so delighted today to be here on the third day of the Literature Festival at the British Library, the 11th year. And when I went up to hear William and Elif Shafak out there, and the stairs were full of people sitting there. They were just overflowing on a Sunday morning and listening and smiling and nodding and getting upset. And so that magic communicates itself, but what is in the magic? If I knew, it wouldn't be magic.
Paro, Dreams of Passion is published by Penguin and is out now. The Jaipur Literature Festival will take place in India from January the 30th to the 3rd of February 2025. Visit their website to book your package. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to the producer Steph Chungu, who also edits the show, with assistance from Elliot Greenfield. You can download this show and previous episodes from our archive. You'll find them on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.